Welcome to the Deep Dive. You're here because, like us, you want to get a real grip on the big questions. And today, we're tackling a huge one.
Yeah, absolutely. Why do some economies just seem to take off and keep going while others get stuck?
Exactly. What are those deep forces behind long-term growth? So our mission today is to dive into a whole stack of pretty dense academic work on growth models.
Right, and pull out the key stuff you need to know. We're covering a lot of ground.
We are, from the classical guys worrying about population,
H.S. Smith.
right, through neoclassical ideas like Solow, and then into the newer stuff, endogenous growth, demography, institutions, even geography.
It's all about that fundamental question. What makes economies prosper in the long run?
Okay, let's jump in, starting way back with the classical growth models. And first up, Thomas Malthus. That name always sounds a bit
Yeah.
gloomy.
Yeah, it often does. The core Malthusian idea, going back to the late 1700s, is this fundamental tension. Population versus resources, specifically food. He basically argued population tends to grow, exponentially fast, way faster than our ability to produce enough food.
So too many mouths to feed, essentially. Sounds pretty grim. What drove that prediction?
Well, two things, mainly. First, what he called the unchanging attraction between the sexes. Basically, people will keep having kids. Population naturally increases.
Okay.
Second, fixed resources. Land, specifically. You add more workers to the same plot of land. Eventually, each extra worker produces less additional food, diminishing returns.
Right, diminishing returns to labor. So anytime things get a bit better, people have more kids.
Exactly. Income goes up, population goes up, and boom, everyone's pushed back down to just getting by. Subsistence level.
Yeah.
That's the Malthusian trap. He talked about positive checks like famine and disease, and preventative checks like marrying later to, control population.
But, clearly that's not the whole story for the last couple of centuries, right? That we escaped the trap, mostly.
Mm-hmm.
Where did Malthus miss the mark, according to these sources?
Yeah, he missed some crucial things. Big ones, really. First, he totally underestimated productivity growth from specialization that's more Adam Smith and from capital accumulation, which Solow focused on later.
Okay, so technology and investment.
Right. Second, he assumed higher income always means more kids. Well, we've seen the opposite in many places, haven't we? People choose fewer kids, invest more in them. That leads into unified growth theory.
The quality-quantity trade-off idea.
Exactly. And third, maybe the biggest miss was not foreseeing sustained, ongoing technological progress, the kind that keeps pushing out those limits. That's central to endogenous growth models.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's move from Malthus's pessimism to Adam Smith, but around the same time, but a different vibe, yeah. What's his core idea on growth?
Totally different vibe. Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, his big idea is specialization. The division of labor. That's the engine.
How so?
Well, when people focus on specific tasks, they get better, faster, more innovative at them. It boosts overall productivity, what economists sometimes call the residual, beyond just adding more people or tools.
So it's about getting smarter at how we produce things through specialization.
Precisely. And this division of labor connects directly to trade. You specialize, I specialize, we trade, we're both better off. Absolute comparative advantage, all that.
Right.
It also allows for larger scale production, which can be more efficient. And crucially, Smith saw that good institutions, secure property, reliable money were vital for all this exchange to happen smoothly.
And he even thought specialization could spark new tech.
Yeah, he suggested that focusing intensely on one part of a process makes you more likely to figure out a better way to do it. So specialization itself can drive innovation.
Interesting. Okay, now, bridging between these older ideas and the more modern stuff, we have the Lewis model. What's that about?
The Lewis model is really about transformation. It describes how an economy shifts from a traditional, usually agricultural setup with tons of hidden unemployment.
Surplus labor, right?
Yeah, exactly. Surplus labor where wages aren't really set by the market, more by custom institutional wages. It shifts from that to a modern industrial sector where wages are market-driven.
Okay, so people moving from farms to factories.
Yeah.
How does that fuel growth?
Because there's all this surplus labor in the traditional sector, the modern factories can hire workers initially without having to raise wages much.
Ah, so low labor costs for industry.
Right, which means higher profits in that modern sector. And here's the key bit for Lewis. Growth keeps going if those profits get reinvested.
Reinvested where? Back into the factories.
Yeah, expanding the modern sector, buying more machines, creating more industrial jobs. This pulls more labor out of agriculture, and the cycle continues until that surplus labor is used up. Then, wages start to rise across the board. It's a model of structural change driven by reinvestment.
Got it. A clear picture of that early industrial takeoff phase. Okay, let's shift gears now to the neoclassical growth models. The Sala model, this feels like Econ 101 for growth.
It really is foundational. Robert Solow won a Nobel for this. The absolute core idea is that piling up physical capital machines, buildings, infrastructure, it drives growth, but only up to a point.
Why only up to a point?
Diminishing returns again, but this time diminishing returns to capital.
Okay, so the first tractor helps a lot, the 10th tractor helps less.
Exactly. Each additional unit of capital yields a smaller and smaller boost to output, assuming other things like labor and technology are constant. So the Solow model predicts that capital accumulation alone leads to growth that slows down over time.
And economies eventually reach what's it called? A steady state.
A steady state, yeah. That's where investment is just enough to replace the capital that wears out or depreciates. In this steady state, the only source of sustained, long-run growth in output per person is technological progress.
But in the basic Solow model, that tech progress just appears. Yeah. Like magic.
Pretty much. It's exogenous. It comes from outside the model. It's not explained by the model. And that was seen as a major limitation.
So how did later models try to fix that, make technology endogenous?
Exactly. That's where new growth theory or endogenous growth theory comes in. People started building models where technological change happens inside the system.
How?
Several ways. One big strand focuses on R&D. Firms invest in research because they hope to discover something new, get a patent, earn some temporary monopoly profits. That profit motive drives innovation.
Okay, so innovation isn't magic. It's driven by economic incentives.
Right. Other models look at human capital education skills. Investing in people makes them more productive and potentially more innovative. You can get these virtuous circles where more physical capital makes investing in skills more worthwhile, and more skills lead to better use of capital and maybe new tech.
So human and physical capital working together.
Yeah, potentially with positive spillovers. My investment in education might make my coworkers more productive too. Some models even link technology directly to capital accumulation itself, maybe you learn by doing, or new machines embody new tech. The key is finding ways for growth not to fizzle out due to diminishing returns.
It's about finding sources of non-diminishing returns, like knowledge spillovers. Okay, fascinating. Now let's bring population back into the picture, but in a different way. The demographic transition. What is that? Quickly.
It's a really fundamental shift we've seen in, well, pretty much every developed country and many developing ones. You go from a situation with very high birth rates and high death rates.
Lots of kids born, but many don't survive long.
Right. To a situation with low birth rates and low death rates. It usually happens in stages as health improves, then later fertility falls.
And this obviously changes population growth patterns dramatically. How does this fit into growth models, especially since it kind of contradicts Malthus's idea that more income equals more babies?
It's a huge challenge to the simple Malthusian view, yeah, because in many societies, as people get richer, they choose to have fewer kids, not more. So economists needed models to explain this.
Like the quantity-quality model, Becker's idea.
Right. Gary Becker's model is key here. He said parents care about both the number of children they have, the quantity, and how well off each child is. Their education, health, the quality.
Okay, a trade-off.
Exactly. The crucial insight or assumption is that as income goes up, the desire for more quantity doesn't rise much, but the desire for more quality rises a lot. So richer parents invest more in fewer kids.
Makes intuitive sense.
Okay.
But the source mentioned a limitation.
Yeah, the basic Becker model explains the shift in behavior, but it doesn't really explain why that preference changes, or when the link between income and having kids flips from positive to negative.
Okay, so it describes the trade-off, but not the trigger for the change. What about the other approach mentioned, unified growth theory? Galer's work.
Oded Galler's unified growth theory is really ambitious. It tries to create one single framework that explains the whole journey from millennia of Malthusian stagnation to the modern era of sustained growth and the demographic transition in between.
Wow, okay. How does it try to do that?
It builds in feedback loops. The core idea is that technological progress depends on the population size and its average education level. But crucially, the return to getting an education depends on how fast technology is changing.
A feedback loop. So technology needs educated people, but education is only really valuable if technology is advancing.
Kind of. In the early Malthusian phase, Technology progresses very slowly. So there's not much point investing heavily in education. Quantity of kids dominates. Any tech gains get eaten by population growth.
Right.
But eventually, maybe population density increases or tech inches forward enough that the demand for skills starts to rise. The return to educating your kids goes up. At some point, you hit a tipping point.
Where quality becomes more important than quantity.
Exactly. The return to education becomes so high that parents shift focus, investing more in fewer children. This boosts the average education level, which then accelerates technological progress, which further increases the return to education.
A virtuous cycle.
A virtuous cycle, yeah. Breaking free from the Malthusian trap and launching into sustained growth, driven by this interplay between technology, education, and fertility choices.
That's a really elegant way to connect those different areas. Okay, so we've talked about capital, technology, population, education, sort of the direct inputs. But the sources also dig deeper, right, into the deep determinants. What's meant by that?
Yeah, this is about asking why. Why are some countries better at accumulating capital or innovating or educating their people in the first place? What are the really fundamental underlying factors? And the big candidates here are institutions and geography.
Let's tackle institutions first.
Mhm.
New institutional economics, NIE. What's the core argument there?
NIE says the rules of the game, the formal and informal institutions of a society are absolutely critical. We're talking about things like, are property rights secure? Can you trust that your investments won't just be taken?
Expropriation risk, right?
Exactly. Are there limits on what rulers or the government can do? Is there social trust? A functioning legal system? Even things like historical legacies, like the type of colonial power, can matter.
And the idea is that good institutions reduce uncertainty.
Precisely. They create a stable, predictable environment where people are willing to invest, trade, innovate, and take risks because they expect to benefit from their efforts. Bad institutions do the opposite. They stifle economic activity.
The sources mention a few specific influential takes on this. Hall and Jones, 1999, The Tropics Theory. What's that angle?
Hall and Jones notice a strong pattern. Countries further from the equator tend to be richer. They argue it's not the climate itself directly, but that distance from the equator acted as a sort of proxy for the type of institutions that got established, largely through European influence.
How so?
Their idea is that European settlers were more likely to migrate and establish long-term settlements in places with climates similar to Europe temperate zones further from the equator. These became Neo-Europes. And in these places, they tended to replicate European-style institutions, like strong property rights and constraints on government power. These good institutions then fostered development. The source has a figure showing this correlation between their social infrastructure index and output.
So climate influenced settlement, which influenced institutions, which influenced long-run wealth. Interesting chain. What about Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson's germs theory from 2001? That sounds dramatic.
It is pretty striking. They also look at colonial history, but their key variable is settler mortality rates.
How many settlers died?
Yeah, mainly from diseases like malaria and yellow fever, which Europeans had little immunity to. Their argument is, in places where settler mortality was high, Europeans didn't want to settle permanently.
Makes sense.
So they set up extractive institutions designed purely to get resources out quickly. Think forced labor, weak property rights, absolute power for the colonizers. These were bad institutions for long-term development.
And where mortality was low,
Where settlers could survive and thrive, they migrated in larger numbers and demanded institutions that protected their own property and rights, similar to those back home. These good institutions, protecting property and constraining the executive, were better for growth in the long run.
so disease patterns centuries ago shaped the institutions that then shaped economic fate.
That's the core argument. Their research traces this causal chain. Settler mortality, settlement patterns, past institutions, current GDP. They use expropriation risk as a key measure of institutional quality. The figures in our source show correlations supporting this higher mortality linked to worse institutions, more risk, and worse institutions linked to lower GDP. It's a powerful idea about how deep history can be.
Really makes you think. Okay, there's another one mentioned. Engerman and Sokolov's crops theory from 2002. How did that fit in?
Benjamin and Sokolov also look at initial conditions, but they focus on things like native population density, soil, and climate, and how these factors influence the type of agriculture that dominated in colonial times.
Like whether you grew Sugar on big plantations or wheat on family farms.
Exactly. They argue that crops suitable for large plantations using slave or coerced labor, like sugar, cotton, coffee, tended to lead to societies with extreme inequality, concentrated political power, and institutions designed to maintain that inequality, like limited access to land, voting, or education for most people.
And that hindered development.
That's the argument. Whereas areas suitable for grains like wheat, often farmed by European families on smaller plots, tended to develop institutions that were more egalitarian, with broader access to land, education, and political participation, which was better for long-run growth.
So the crops shaped the initial economic structure, which then shaped the institutions.
Right, their model goes. Initial factor endowments, mode of production, past institutions, current institutions, and ADP. The source has some charts on historical land ownership and voting rates that illustrate these different paths.
These are all really compelling stories about institutions mattering deeply. But the source also flags some criticisms, right?
Yeah, it's not without debate. One big challenge is causality. Does development lead to better institutions rather than the other way around? Or is it a feedback loop?
Chicken and egg.
Kind of. Also, some argue that institutions might explain the really big differences, like North versus South Korea, but maybe not the finer differences between, say, similar countries in Latin America or Europe, and the big one. What about geography itself? Maybe institutions are important, but geography is even more fundamental.
Okay, so that brings us neatly to the geography view,
Yeah.
including New Economic Geography, NAG. How does this perspective differ?
NE takes geography much more seriously than the standard neoclassical models, which often assume away distance and location. It argues geography creates real fundamental wedges or differences in how efficiently things can be produced in different places.
Unlike NAE, which focuses on institutional wedges.
Right. N emphasizes things like factors of production, labor, capital aren't perfectly mobile. There are often increasing returns to scale. It's cheaper to produce a lot in one place, and transaction costs, especially transport costs, are significant.
And what's the implication of all that?
Location matters. Economic activity isn't spread evenly. It tends to cluster in certain favorable locations. That's agglomeration. This means convergence, the idea that poor places will automatically catch up to rich ones, might be limited by geographical disadvantages. The table in the source shows how shipping costs alone can dictate whether production concentrates in a core region or spreads out.
So where you are physically located on the map is a primary constraint or advantage. Jeffrey Sachs's work is mentioned, looking at latitude specifically. What direct effects does he point to?
Sachs argues that tropical locations often face direct disadvantages. Things like poorer soils, more pests and diseases affecting agriculture and people.
Like malaria.
Exactly. Less ideal conditions for staple grains, water variability, maybe fewer easily accessible resources like coal back in the day, and often higher transport costs due to terrain or distance from markets. The source shows that latitude correlation with GDP again.
A whole list of potential direct geographical hurdles. What about being landlocked? That seems like an obvious geographical issue.
Huge issue, according to Sachs and others. Being landlocked dramatically increases trade costs. You're dependent on your neighbor's infrastructure, their political stability, their port efficiency.
Yeah, you have to ship goods through someone else's territory.
Right. It adds costs and risks. The comparison chart in the source, showing GDP for landlocked versus coastal countries, really highlights this persistent disadvantage.
And finally, Shedvin's idea about historical crop types. How does that link geography to development?
Shedvin looked back at the 19th century and argued that geography determined which crops could be grown effectively, and that had long-term impacts. Countries whose geography favored wheat production tended to do better.
Why wheat?
He called it a super staple, maybe because it had stronger links to broader economic development like milling, transport, urbanization. In contrast, he found that specializing in cash crops, tobacco, coffee, cocoa, was often associated with poorer long-term performance.
Possibly because of that inequality link Angerman and Sokoloff talked about.
Possibly, yeah. More unequal societies linked to those crops, which might have hindered broader development. The scatter plots provided show these varying relationships between historical crop patterns and current GDP in former colonies.
Wow. Well, okay, this has been an incredible tour through so many different ways of thinking about economic growth. It's definitely not simple, is it?
Not at all. It's clearly super complex. What we've seen is that each of these models, from Malthus worrying about land limits, to Smith seeing the power of specialization, Solow highlighting capital and tech, the endogenous folks looking at innovation, the demographic models, the institutionalists, the geographers. They all shed light on different important parts of the puzzle.
Yeah, there's no single silver bullet. It's this interplay between resources, population dynamics, technology, how we organize ourselves in society, and the physical realities of the planet we live on.
Absolutely. A rich tapestry, as you said earlier.
So for you, our listener, reflecting on all this, the classical limits, the engines of innovation, the crucial rules of the game, the fundamental role of location. If you had to pick one element, thinking about the future, the 21st century, what do you think holds the most potential to unlock sustained progress? Something to chew on. Thanks for diving deep with us today.